Warm greetings. The topic of my talk is construing our experience of pandemics in complementary contexts. Let me do a little introduction before I get started on the slide presentation. Welcome to one of the first talks in today's and tomorrow's wonderful weekend conference. For reasons beyond our control, we are of course in virtual mode, but I think in the last year, or almost year and a half, we've learned to make lemonade out of the lemons dealt us by COVID. So we make the most out of the opportunity to come together virtually and to listen to pre-recorded sessions. At the same time, I look forward very much to tomorrow when we'll have an opportunity to come together in real time, synchronously, in a virtual roundtable. As a way of warming up for this conference, this two-day conference, I've chosen to give a talk entitled Construing Our Experience of Pandemics in Complementary Contexts. Now, as a preamble, let me say a little bit about each. So construing, that means interpreting and representing. Construing our experience means turning our experience into meaning. Meaning that we can exchange in little groups, in larger groups, in networks of groups, in whole communities, in extended international, even global communities. And pandemics, in a sense, is shorthand for the worst case scenario where an outbreak of communicable disease, becomes an epidemic and then becomes an epidemic. So I'll say a little bit about our experience relating to disease, illness, viruses that cause them, epidemics, pandemics, monitoring these. And the whole question is, how do we come to terms with this in language? How do we use the resources of language to make sense of these for ourselves, our experience of these? So that's the notion of construing experience of these as models of meaning. Meanings that can be exchanged, as I put it. And complementary context, well, how do we construe experiences? We do this in texts and discourses. And different texts, different discourses operate in different contexts. Overall, these contexts complement one another. They have different goals, they cover different activities, different interactions and different roles. And together, they make up a kind of collage that we can make sense of to understand how we are affected by outbreaks of diseases, communicable diseases, by epidemics, by pandemics. So I'll say something about these complementary contexts. I'll use the notion of what's the activity going on in the context. Spoken, written, different channels, different interactions, different roles. And part of the point is they complement one another. And together they give us maybe a kind of balanced sense of what's happening. But each context calls for different discourses, texts, and we do different things in these discourses. We may construct scientific knowledge, expand knowledge. We may give advice. We may give instructions, say for example, how to put on a mask. We may chat in a small group of friends or family members, sharing opinions or personal experiences. And nowadays, of course, what used to be kind of casual conversation by the fireplace in small group tribal societies shades into public evaluation, arguing about value systems, stances, ideas. And that's of course because of the developments in the technology of the channel. so-called social media that can be used in many different ways. So I'll touch on a number of these things. This will involve reporting on some past work, present activities, and also looking towards the future. And what I hope in weaving these together is that maybe I can stimulate or I can take part in collaborative discussions, collaborative research, and I hope that's one of the outcomes of this conference. That we come together as a group, but what lasts beyond the conference is a network of people who know each other better than we did at the outset, about each other's work. We can consult one another, we can find ways of working together, and of course the conference is designed to produce publications that we can all be proud of and refer to, and ensure that all the brain power that goes into this conference, the collective brain power, the social brain, the collective social brain, the language brain, through the exchange of meanings, actually is part of the record and becomes a resource through the discourses that are published for future steps. So let me get started. Many thanks for taking part, and as I said, I look forward to rounding up with you at the round table tomorrow. Now, one phenomenon that perhaps many would think of immediately when we talk about the construction of our experience of disease, illness, epidemics, pandemics, and so on, is metaphor. And that was, of course, partly or to a large extent due to Susan Sontag's book, published initially in the late 70s, Illness as Metaphor. And it's now become part of the public discourse, so people are very much aware of these metaphorical construals. And there's been a good deal of work in linguistics and cognitive linguistics under the heading of conceptual metaphor. These are really lexical metaphors. So towards the lexical end of lexicogrammar, the resource for constructing meanings as wordings. And of course it's highly relevant, but it won't be the focus in the talk today. I will give a couple examples. I would also like to, in this area, draw attention to something that is at least as important, or at least you could say that it is more deceptively important, and that's grammatical metaphor. So metaphor towards the grammatical end of lexicogrammar. That includes, but is not limited to, process normalization such as transmission, infection, outbreak, incubation, notification, exposure, contact, and also, for example, case fertility, morbidity, rate, death rate, and so on. And these can have the combined effect of, as it were, effacing individual people who are exposed to diseases or patients. And it becomes a discourse of these virtual things. So we've all met examples of such metaphors. I'll just give a couple of examples before moving on. So, for example, in the history of the Great Plague, England's political upheavals, however, did not augur well for London's battle with the Great Plague of 1665. So that's one of the prevalent metaphorical system. So treating diseases as war, or from where the weekly epidemiological record issued by WHO, demonstrating the international cooperation in fighting measles can benefit all. Or an announcement last year, President Trump talking about being a wartime president. And here's somebody commenting, we're at war, the enemy is called COVID. The question is, do we have the guts that our grandfathers had to mobilize the economy of the United States against this enemy? And before leaving this topic, I'll just note that people have problematized it. saying if we map the domain of monitoring, treating patients suffering from diseases, having caught diseases, as a warlike operation, is this actually beneficial in our understanding of what's going on, but also in how we take steps to do something about it? So, for example, here, the virus has become entangled with military metaphors and analogies, leading academics like Cynthia Enlow to argue that waging a war against the virus is a problematic frame to use. So, of course, this is one of the contributions we can make as linguists, as discourse analysts, as scholars, researchers, and also general members of the public engaging with discourse at a time like this. Now, by now, the tools are available for searching for trends through language. So in large flows of text, we can search for trends. They tend to be somewhat superficial because they have to be based on orthographic words or little networks of orthographic words interpreting what are likely to be lexicogrammatical words. And this has been published under the heading of culturomics. We're familiar with it with tools like Google's Ngram Viewer or Google Trends. So, for example, in a very large volume of discourse, we can look at the trend of pandemic, or rather 2019-20 coronavirus pandemic as a disaster topic. And we can see that it has a very clear profile, as you would expect with a disaster. So not a gradual increase in mentions, but a clearly exponential one. And we can compare that with treating COVID-19 as a search term in itself, or related to vaccine, and then we can see what's happening. And in this little display, you can see that at some point, some of the terms trail off, but vaccine shoots into much higher frequency. So that's a way we can track the way people are aware of or discuss or talk about in certain context these phenomena. Now that's of course a new development, being able to track them, but also being able to disseminate this information, or not just information, but discussions of, or discursive treatments of such phenomena. And here is a little comparison part of a very interesting talk given by Dr. Orobi, comparing the so-called Spanish flu from 1918, and COVID-19. And the issue here is volume of information and the lasting awareness of this volume of information.
Another difference here. Again, I mentioned that. In some ways, for decades after the Spanish flu, that killed more people than World War I had. People didn't talk about it much. It just wasn't at the forefront of people's mind, and I don't think we're ever going to have anything similar with COVID-19. It's a time of almost information overload in some ways. And it's just interesting to think about the psychological impact that this virus is having compared to the Spanish flu, which kind of washed over the population, and then people went on, those who survived, tried to go on with life and not think about it too much.
So disasters are of different kinds, of course. There are ones that have a very sharp profile, sharp beginning, and maybe sharp end. Like, for example, a fire depicted here by the Swedish artist Matthiessen. But some disasters are more difficult to detect. This is another disaster, and is from the World War II period, again by Matthiessen, depicting people flowing in a rowboat from Denmark to Sweden to avoid Nazi-occupied Denmark. Now this disaster built up, and of course the magnitude of it only becomes visible when you take further steps back. So that's a question of detecting or early detection of disasters, or summarizing many incidents that turn out to have this volume effect. Now, in construing a virus or the evolution of the virus, it's interesting again how we model the virus, how we talk about it. And I'll focus on just one example to raise awareness about this, and that's the issue of how we construe microorganisms like viruses as participants in different processes. So here's a transcript of part of an interview with Geert van den Bosche, and he talks about the evolution of viruses. He describes this. In blue, you have examples of viruses in participants in material clauses representing actions, activities, doings and happenings. So for example, he says, if you put a living organism like a special bacteria or viruses under pressure, or you put it under life-threatening pressure, life-threatening to the microorganism, okay, or a lot of these organisms will die, or if you cannot kill them all, or you're threatening it, or positively for these microorganisms, it can replicate, that enable them to replicate, or even referring to them as these folks are mutating all the time, okay, or that enable them to survive. So that's a illustration of treating them as in participants in process of action, activity, events. But interestingly, he also talks about them in terms that suggest that they have some kind of intentionality or some kind of consciousness. You have this in orange. They say they will start to select mutations. They will start to select mutations. Selecting mutations. Or they don't see the need to select specific mutations. Or they can choose amongst a multitude of mutations. They will select those mutations. Or as statements about what they possess or have a high capacity for mutation, or they're just fine. Now this is an expert with a PhD, but we can see that it's a struggle to construe evolutionary processes. Of course, the viruses don't choose, they don't select, and they don't see or not see a need for anything. To give a sense, have a little listen to this. This is just an example of the challenges we find in using the resource of language in such a way that we construe an effective picture of what's happening.
Well, Matt, let me try to explain this in simple words. There is a kind of general principle in, I would say, in biology, certainly also in vaccinology, in microbiology. And that is that if you put a living organism, like especially bacteria or viruses, under pressure, whether you do this by antibodies or chemotherapeutic or antibiotics, it doesn't matter. You put it under life-threatening pressure, life-threatening to the microorganism. And you do this in a way that you still allow that microorganism to replicate to some extent. Of course, it will have a very tough time because you're threatening it, and a lot of these microorganisms will die. But if you cannot really kill them all, let's say, if you cannot prevent completely the infection, and if there is still some microorganisms that can replicate despite this huge pressure, they will start to select mutations that enable them to survive. So what does that mean, selecting mutations? Well, these microorganisms, and especially as we know also COVID-19, has a high capacity for mutation. So these folks are mutating all the time, and if they are not under pressure, they don't see any need to select specific mutations to become, for example, more infectious or what. There is no need to do that because they are just fine. But if now you start to put some pressure, whether this is by drugs or, as I was saying, antibiotics in case of bacteria, of course, not in case of viruses, or our natural antibiotics, our natural antiviral antibiotics, these are, so to say, the antibodies that you develop when you are, for example, immunized, be it by a natural route, for example, through natural infection or through vaccination. If you put these guys now under pressure, they can choose amongst a multitude of mutations, and they will select those mutations that enable them to survive.
Okay, so
I need to continue this, because this in its own right would not be a disaster, certainly not for viruses. Why? Because as we all know, viruses can only multiply.
All right, we'll leave Gert there. Now, he prefaced by saying, let me put this in simple terms. One interesting issue, of course, is what's the status of viruses? And here's a view from another person, the legendary originator of the Gaia hypothesis, James Lovelock. So he said in a book in 1991, Gaia, the practical science of planetary medicine. Okay. But what about viruses, which are even smaller? Aren't these alive? Perhaps, but I prefer to think of viruses as no more than pieces of software of life. They're just a set of instructions expressed in the common genetic code, etc. So we see by exploring the way in which people construe viruses, we already arrive at a very interesting problem in understanding them. Now let me move on to construing diseases, or outbreaks of diseases. And I will take as an example, introductory example, the WHO's weekly epidemiological record. And let me go back about a quarter of a century to a series of weekly records presented by them during a period when there was an outbreak of Ebola hemorrhagic fever. And in those days, the reports were presented in this way, parallel English and French. Now you can get access to more languages. And I compiled a little corpus of these, looking at the English version, to develop an analysis and then a description of their domain model. So the model of outbreaks of communicable diseases that came through text by text in this little corpus. And that's one visualization of the model as a network of relationships. So for example, if you take this, the recent outbreak of hemorrhagic fever. Now that, of course, is a process nominalization. So meaning it's a nominal version of a clausal. Hemorrhagic fever recently broke out in, etc. And if you look at the representation of this recent outbreak of hemorrhagic fever, then it involves this region of the network of relations that constitute the domain. So you have a disease, hemorrhagic fever, and that takes part in a process of breaking out, but that process is reified, it's thingified, it's turned into a virtual thing, outbreak. And that's what's represented by the shaded area of gray in this domain model. And that turns out to be quite common in this discourse. And that's an instance of grammatical metaphor. you can see around this not only outbreak, but also transmission, notification, incubation, infection. These are all, as it were, reified processes that then in turn become participants in other processes. So that's what the domain model that I constructed based on the corpus of words in the mid-90s. So we can move from the top and sort of see a flow of control in different processes. So at the top you have institutions like the WHO, health authorities, national and local ones, and they brief health workers, they recommend proposals to health workers, they try to prevent, control, minimize the impact of outbreaks and so on. And then you have health workers. Obviously they play an important role in this domain model. They have sensors, they detect, they register, they recognize, identify, they suspect diseases, and they try to isolate viruses and so on. And then you begin to get to people, but they don't have a very prominent role unless they turn out to be cases or exposed contact with outbreaks of diseases. So people play a role as cases, so incidents of diseases, and then they can have attributes like fatality, case fatality, and so on. Morbidity. And then as cases, they can increase, they decline, steady, and they can then have numerical attributes and so on. So just a hint at the kind of view of the world according to this scientific vantage point on tracking outbreaks of communicable diseases. So top we have the institutions, and they arrange, strengthen, control, they brief, recommend health workers. And health workers, they operate, administer, hospitalize, trace patients, they report, detect, suspect diseases. And then animals are also part of this domain because they transmit diseases. And then transmit diseases becomes transmission. And then diseases, of course, they break out or they infect people. And then the diseases are part of outbreaks of diseases, and outbreaks of diseases, well, that's a process of normalization, develop, increase, spread. What about people? Well, they catch diseases, or they are or become or fall ill with symptoms. You have cases where people turn into cases, and these cases increase and decline, and you have increased decline of cases and numbers. So this is quite a scientific view in terms of reporting, recording, monitoring. And here people become cases and viruses only in a sense part of the picture in terms of diseases and the transmission of diseases and so on. Now contrast that around the same time with the way it would be reported in the news, in the general news. So here is a CNN report from 1995, a news report. Fear among us, deadly Ebola virus lurks in the shadows. Okay, so here the virus is foregrounded as something threatening, a participant that lurks in the shadows. In 1976, Ebola climbed out of its primordial hiding place in the jungles of Africa, etc. It wiped out 600 people. The virus attacks every organ of the body and transforms every part of the body into digestive slime of virus particles. And then from the point of view of patients, Ebola virus victims usually crash and bleed. Okay, so you see it's the same domain of experience in general, but the model of the domain is fairly different, and is partly construed, of course, to increase the news value of this, something that will catch your attention as a viewer or reader. With viruses as actors in different processes, and fear and uncertainty also metaphorically as actors gripping, torturing, and so on. And if we try to compare this to the domain model in the WHO reports, we in fact see that it is very partial, but also highly selective, and it creates a different viewpoint. It foregrounds certain aspects and backgrounds other aspects. So that's an example of how we access, as a general public, information about outbreaks of communicable diseases. Now, these are examples of different angles, different fields of activities. So one is a scientific monitoring of outbreaks of communicable diseases produced by the WHO, and the other is a daily news cycle by a general public news organization like CNN. And these are just examples of a more general picture, which here I characterize as a discursive process of experience of a pandemic in a range of different contexts. So disease, outbreak of disease, epidemic, pandemic. And I'll use a typology of fields of activity to give a sense, an indication of how diversified this, how varied this is, and how they all represent different ways of approaching our experience. So here we can expand knowledge about viruses, as I suggested, about outbreaks of communicable diseases. We can also report on them, so we can characterize viruses, epidemics, pandemics, and I already illustrated the challenges in doing this. In reporting, we can report on academics, we can monitoring, we can recount. But then from the factual, we can move into the fictional, so we can recreate experience of epidemics, pandemics, fictionalizing them in narration or possibly drama, so literary constructs. Or in a circle of friends, family members, we can chat about epidemics or pandemics, sharing opinions of them, values of them, personal experience, and so on. Or there are texts that will direct procedures in how you deal with this, some aspect of it. And there are enabling context where some authority tries to regulate public behavior, or so make them obliged to do something, or enable them to do something, instructing public behavior. So this is part of public health. And also recommend, advising the public, or promoting some course of action. And then finally, in the public sphere, debating course of action, debating evaluations, or debating the value system relating to diseases, outbreaks of diseases, epidemics, pandemics, and measures taken. So, for example, there can be a history of the Great Plague in 1665 in England, factual recounting, or there can be something that for a long time was debated, Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, by many thought to be an actual history, but it was, as it were, a fictionalized history. But there was a long debate, and it was only began to be settled around the 1820s, if I remember correctly, because it was so good as a reconstruction of the experience of the plague year in London. And then there are pure fictionalizations like Albert Camus' La Peste, and many of these, of course, in disaster films. So you can say that there is a kind of climb from very factual to purely fictionalized. And they're part, of course, of how this experience is framed, but then also templates guiding us in interpreting, representing, understanding, and then maybe acting on our understanding. Let me just give a couple of examples, a few examples of discourses in different contexts. So exploring, trying to rally people around some course of action. Let me return to Gert. Now note this is a very controversial issue. So what he says here is directed towards the WHO, but is controversial. Have a listen.
Dear colleagues at the WHO, my name is Geert van den Bosch. My background is veterinary medicine. I'm a certified expert in microbiology and infectious diseases. I have a PhD in virology and I have a long-standing career in human vaccinology. I'm urging you to immediately open the scientific debate on how human interventions in the COVID-19 pandemic are currently driving viral immune escape. I'm urging you to invite me for a scientific hearing open to the public and to scientists all over the world on this very topic. Ignoring or denying the impact of stringent infection prevention measures combined with mass.
So I think you have a sense here how different this is from his attempt at construing the evolution of viruses and mutations. This is much more value-laden as a discourse, and that's what we expect from a context of exploring ideas, public values, arguing about them, urging some action. What about chronicling? Well, here is an example from the book I referred to before, a chronicle of the Great Plague, the story of London's most deadly year. With a long text like this, we can certainly use corpus linguistics or even NLP style tools to explore the text and try to bring out patterns. But any automated analysis will inevitably be fairly low level. If you want to get more high level, more meaning oriented, contextually aware analysis, it still has to be manual. And that means that the volume of text we can study shrinks. So you can see, for example, in this total body of text in the book, London is very common, Pepys is common, 1665, but what stands out is, of course, plague. And if we look at this over the different segments of the book from beginning to end, you see that all through the book, plague is the most frequent term. And then other terms vary in frequency. Now we can put that together with other terms that have to do with outbreaks of communicable diseases, like death, disease, epidemic, infected, infection, mortality, plague, and so on. And we can look at this over the unfolding of the whole book. Plague dominates, but we see at certain points other terms become more frequent. And then we can dive into that segment of the book to see what's happening at that point. We can just get a list of the most frequent terms. Okay? That gives us a sense. So there's a great deal we can do with this kind of analysis of factual text recounts of outbreaks of communicable diseases. And that would be very different from personalized experience. So let me give a brief example of this. Now, sharing personal experience, reminiscing with somebody. And here's an interview with a 100-year-old survivor of the Spanish flu, so-called Spanish flu in 1918. So-called because it didn't actually originate in Spain. So have a listen to this, and you see the very different nature of this angle on the experience of disease.
In 19, we had the Spanish influenza. That was memorable.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. We didn't dare play with anybody. Had to stay away from kids, absolutely. Because kids seem to be the biggest carriers. And I lost a few friends that I used to play with all the time, but they died from flu. And I remember one time a mother asking me whether I was mad at a certain boy. I said, no, why? Well, she said, he just died. And Sunday morning, we'd go to Sunday school. And you didn't.
So you have the URL there, and you can watch this eyewitness or instance of oral history and others as well. And they're important because they give us a sense of what happened to particular people, their experiences at different ages. In this case, because these interviews took place about 90 years after the actual outbreak, reflecting children's experience. Now again, then, this is very different from characterizing and explaining. We return to more scientific gaze on such phenomena. And let me give you a little example from a video that says, where do viruses come from?
Digital studios. The Earth never shook beneath their feet. We've never found their remains in the rocks. And by some standards, they're not even alive. They're just bits of protein and genetic information that might give you a sniffle for a couple of days, or worse. But they're also proof that even the very smallest things can have an outsized impact on the history of life.
So here we're back with the scientific gaze, trying to explain, understand the phenomenon in terms of the general class of ingredients, as it were, like viruses. Okay? So complementary to the personal experience of some particular outbreak of a disease. Now, when a disease rages, as I said before, one of the public health contributions is to instruct people in how to proceed. Let me give you an example of that. So this is again from the WHO, an instruction how to wear a fabric mask. Just a little excerpt. Again, you have the URL if you'd like to view the whole text.
Hello, today I'd like to talk to you about how to wear a non-medical mask, also known as fabric mask. Fabric masks can be used by the general public in areas where there are many people infected with COVID-19 in the community and physical distancing of at least 1 meter cannot be achieved. There are a wide variety of fabric masks that can be handmade or purchased in a store. They act as a barrier so that you can protect those around you. They should ideally be made of 3 layers of fabric. The outer layer should be a water-resistant fabric. The inner layer should be water absorbent, and the mid layer acts as a filter. First, clean your hands with alcohol-based hand rub or soap and water. Pick up your clean mask and inspect it. If it is damaged or dirty, do not wear it. Place the mask on your face covering your nose, mouth, and chin, making sure there are no gaps between your face and the mask. Do not touch the mask while wearing it to avoid contamination. If you accidentally do, clean your hands.
I think this is now something we can all do in our sleep, right? You'll note the difference in the text in these different contexts. So the personal reminiscence was, of course, in the past tense. The explanation characterization also switches to the present, but now we're in the realm of how to. So you get modalities of obligation, should, and you also get quite a few imperative clauses, because what this person is doing is instructing us in how to wear a mask. So we get inundated with lots of different texts. And the ones that are informative in nature, the ones that deal with information, of course, raise the issue of what's the quality of information. And the challenge is now, you think the contrast between the Spanish flu in 1918-19 and COVID-19 is we have much more information and it keeps washing around, as it were. So the issue of fact-checking. And again, the WHO is making contribution here. And they say, let's flatten the infodemic curve. So that's, of course, an interesting term for thinking about the spread of information on the model of an epidemic. And so part of their website is myth busting. And you can look this up and can help sorting the quality of information. And it's precisely the larger the volume, the harder it is to evaluate the quality of the information. Accuracy, bias, and so on. So for example, this is one of the facts they present. Hand sanitizer can be used often. So there's no problem with alcohol addiction if you use them, right? So it's one of the many facts they present that you can look up. And they also draw attention to the value of checking the quality of information. So if you stop bad information, misleading information, inaccurate information, false information, then you help stop the spread of this semiotic equivalent of a virus-based or bacterium-based communicable disease. Because discourses you can think of as communicable diseases, or the meanings that they construct and are exchanged. So if we can stop the infectious ones that are harmful to us, then that is very helpful. So that's one contribution we can make as linguists, discourse analysts, providing people with the tools, even if it's just tools for more reflective, critical viewing of the text, the discourse we're presenting with. And that, of course, leads us to the question about the role of social media. So so-called social media, of course, contribute to this eruption of texts, little texts. Now, social media is really just a term for a channel. So there are lots of things we can do with these channels, just like telephonic versus face-to-face interaction versus telegrams and so on. It's a channel that we open to people. And the question is, what's their role on an occasion like this? And in one of the talk show hosts, Jimmy Kimmel, asked an expert on this, Tony Fauci, on the role of social media. So have a listen to Fauci's response. Now, what kind of context are we in? Well, we are in a context, of course, of reporting, interviewing, but it also has, being a talk show host format, some entertainment value. So it should be done in such a way that is captivating and say titillates the audience.
Now, this is the first pandemic we've had in the era of social media. Do you feel like that it has been, because obviously there are good things where you can get the information out more quickly and people can sign up online and whatnot, but also it's easier to spread disinformation. Do you think social media has been good or bad in the context of getting people vaccinated?
Yeah, I think it's total mixed blessing, Jimmy. I think it's both good and bad. Getting information out to people, you can do it quickly and you can do it in bulk. But also when you get disinformation, conspiracy theories, out and out fabrications, that gets frustrating, because when people go through social media, sometimes they can't distinguish the complete nonsense from the things that are really important to them. That's the problem.
Speaking of complete nonsense, when's the last time you talked to Donald Trump?
Well, I believe.
So this is also how to make a serious scientist laugh. So let me try to conclude this by suggesting that there are many contexts in which texts are produced, are consumed, are negotiated in dealing with a phenomenon like outbreak of a communicable disease that may become an epidemic, then a pandemic. And I suggested is a kind of multifaceted view we given in these, or we help produce in these different contexts. So the question of the adoption of point of view, the adoption of a vantage point at which we, through which we discursively process what we experience and the values attached and so on, is very important. So the importance of the point of view. And I suggested one way of doing this is to systematically go through the different activities in context. If we're expanding knowledge about the phenomenon, we're reporting on instances of it, or we're recreating it imaginatively, or we're sharing personal opinions, experiences, and so on and so forth. That's very important. And then the challenge of arriving at a kind of balanced picture, a well-rounded one. Well, a well-rounded one would be one where you move around this, what we've called the discursive wheel of fortune. So you expand, you report, you recreate, you share, you do, you enable, you recommend, and you explore. So when you look at this, when you view this through the discourses, through the text, it's important then to be aware of the vantage point. And this vantage point then will give you a certain perspective. And I borrowed from an exhibition at the Museum of the Portuguese Language in Sao Paulo in 2006, so a while back. And this temporary exhibition included one of the great novels in Brazilian Portuguese. And the exhibition gave a great sense of what sampling text is like. The large sheets or pages you see hanging from the ceiling are magnified pages of all the manuscript pages of this great novel. And you can look at them from different angles, adopting different vantage points, and you can hoist them down and look at them in detail, close up, or you can move away and you can see the whole forest of the pages that constitute the novel. So the adoption of a vantage point to get a different perspective is very significant. If we think about what dominates or what is available to us, we could again go through the fields of activity, and I'll just pick out a few. So our view could be from the point of view of expanding reporting. where the understanding is data-based or fact-based or data-driven, or we can adopt a sharing context where it's to do with personal experience or personal opinions, or an enabling context where you say it's practice-based, what do we do? Or an exploring one, which is axiology-based. What are the values, the public value system, and how is this debated, argued about? What are people rallied around in terms of ideas, values, and so on? The danger, of course, for any group of people, any person, a group of people, is a kind of foregrounding of only one vantage point, or a kind of skewing of the balance of vantage points. And it seems through so-called social media that sharing blending or shading into exploring, kind of very value-oriented in terms of opinions, comes to dominate. There's a kind of foregrounding of the interpersonal over the ideational. So as part of a conclusion then, let me quote something that Michael Halliday wrote a bit over a decade ago, that from the current period is actually very prescient. So he's talking about the evolution of language. So he says, even within one language, we can see new patterns in the integration of the metafunctions. So ideational, interpersonal, textual. Integration of metafunctions, with meanings now packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks. Why? To accommodate the reduced space on a small screen and the reduced time scale of much of today's interaction, and perhaps the reduced attention span of the interactants. Here both the interpersonal and the textual meanings take on a new prominence, though for different reasons. The textual in integrating the various semiotic strands, with the interesting consequence that it becomes less explicit in the text, rather like the subtitles in a foreign language movie. The interpersonal, on the other hand, becoming more explicit as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized. So, for example, we're never shown parliamentary debates on our television screens, only the ranting and swapping of abuses that are thought to make good television. And he continues, here you can hear the interpersonal element intruding into my own text, since it's clear that I don't like to find so much meaning reduced to a series of bite-sized chunks, and I don't like the way any thoughtful discourse by those who we've elected to govern us is overtaken by verbal brawling. And I blame the media for it. That explains the square quotes when I just referred to what I referred to as good television. This is just one small symptom, not itself important, but then symptoms never are, but symptomatic of a process that I have talked about as the distraction of knowledge, which is an old-fashioned socialist and lifetime as an old-fashioned socialist and lifetime Marxist, I see as part of the death throes of what is now corporate capitalism. Capitalism is a social political structure that was spectacularly successful when it first evolved, because the controls evolved along with it. Because its controls evolved along with it. But it has now passed its use-by date. It has moved on, as most structures do, from being enabling to being constraining, and will destroy anything in its ruthless determination to survive. But what is happening to knowledge is perhaps not so much its destruction in absolute terms, but its polarization. The increasing gap in our society between the knows and the don't knows, replacing the haves and the have-nots, which has become a worldwide phenomenon, inter rather than intra-societal. Either way, of course, it is destructive. But let me return to history and to my various schemata of periodization, and ask how knowledge has been construed in language at different periods of our history. When, as I just put it now, our living space was defined by the forest, when we were hunter-gatherers, then by farm, when agriculture involved, and herding, and then by factory. I haven't got a fourth term for that series, which ought to also begin with an F. Perhaps fantasy might be appropriate as any, so the period we now live in. So when we consider the different angles, represented here by one particular view, that of the discursive pie of fortune, it makes sense to explore from the point of view of a person in the collective of society who is active in which slice of the discursive pie, and which ones do we take in as producers, as consumers, and how well-rounded is the picture we arrive at. But also from the point of view of the kind of instantiation, particularly instantial texts, acts of meaning, towards the overall meaning potential. And where is our sample located? As individual meaners, as people in meaning groups, in a community, in an overall society. And these are, of course, challenges in coming to terms with a phenomenon like COVID-19. Now, if the discourse has been a little bit gloomy, let me end with a kind of pleasant painting, a watercolor by Martin Eman again. A nice island with palm trees. And if you're among the super rich, you know that you can use your Learjet to self-isolate in this spot. But hopefully we can all, with balance and help from each other, arrive at some kind of idyllic island of meaning, one where we can cope with all the challenges we face. Thank you very much.